And we're going to make a start today. This is where we want to go. We want to get through the last two chapters of Revelation. And I want to do that in this first section. And then you guys can go into breakout rooms and talk a little bit about what stood out to you over these 4 weeks, what made an impact on you in these 4 weeks, and whether or not your thinking, your understanding, or something has changed for you about the book of Revelation. I hope it's become clearer. I hope it's become less confusing and mystifying for you, and you can discuss that in your breakout rooms. And then what I want to do for the last session of today is actually look at the importance of the book of Revelation for our Christian spirituality, our lived experience of faith. That's what spirituality means, our lived experience of faith. What does the book of Revelation have to say to us about how to live as faithful disciples of Jesus Christ? I think it's an incredibly important book for that. So without further ado, let me share my screen. The right one. It's always awkward, isn't it, when you go to share your screen and you pick the wrong screen? Okay, here we go. So the book of Revelation, chapters 21 and 22. This is, I think it was Richard Bauckham who said that Revelation 21 and 22 is the climax. It's like the soaring crescendo of the musical score. It's the absolute peak of the book of Revelation. It's what everything has been building to in the previous 20 chapters. But not only that, it's not just the climax of this book, but it's the climax of the whole New Testament, and it's actually the climax of the whole Bible, and actually it's the climax of the whole story of God. So everything that God has been at work doing from creation and during the life of Israel and the life of Jesus and our lives today and sometime in the future, this is the climax. This is what everything is building towards. And so it's an exciting couple of chapters in the book, and I actually think an incredibly powerful couple of chapters. So earlier in the week, I posted this PDF, this image, this graphic of how the book of Revelation uses the Old Testament, or the connections from the Old Testament to ideas that are in the book of Revelation, and where they fit, and where they how John is using his scriptures, the Old Testament, to bring new life and to think about the truth of God and the truth of what's happening right now in this moment for John, and in our moment today and sometime in the future. How John is rethinking his scriptures and bringing them to light in a new way. And so here's another, we won't go through this, but just something for you maybe when you have the chance to look at the PowerPoints later. Something for you to consider, all of these Old Testament connections. So this is, on top of, Revelation 1 to 5, and all of this rich Old Testament imagery that's in there as well. These are some additional things that we didn't look at, but have these Old Testament connections. So you're free to research and look at that later. There's this is relevant for these final two chapters. There's this interesting thing about how John uses the Old Testament concepts and ideas. So what he often does is take an idea that existed in the Old Testament, which was specifically for a particular person or particular people, like the people of Israel or the nation of Israel, and he universalizes them. So it's a very specific promise. It's a very specific statement to a group of people who exist in the world, surrounded by all kinds of different nations. John takes that idea and he globalizes it. He universalizes it. He busts the walls down and makes it so much bigger. So just a couple of examples. So God gives Israel the title a kingdom of priests in Exodus 19. So that's a statement God makes to a nation, a specific nation, that they would be a kingdom of priests. But John applies this to the church. in Revelation, two places, Revelation 1 and Revelation 5. So no longer is this a promise made to an ethnic group of people. It's globalized, it's universalized to include this multinational, multi-ethnic group of people who call themselves the church, the people of God, right? In Exodus, the plagues that are directed at Egypt, in Exodus, plagues are directed at Egypt in the Old Testament, but in Revelation, the scope is the whole earth. So we looked at that last week, the judgment of God pouring out these bowls, these plagues, not just on a specific nation, but actually it has a wider scope than that. The end times temple in Ezekiel is not just for faithful Jews. In Revelation, its benefits are for all faithful people. Again, we'll see this after the break, but the idea of faithfulness and obedience and discipleship and in our spirituality is key. It's central to the book of Revelation. And then finally, the New Jerusalem is now not just a renewed city, literally Jerusalem in Israel, but it's a picture used to describe the entire new creation that God is at work bringing about and restoring. So John is taking these ideas and he's blowing it wide open. So what was for a specific people is now for all people, all faithful people. Again, Richard Bauckham says, in the beginning, God had planted a garden for humanity to live in Genesis chapter 2. And in the end, he will give them a city. Again, there was something in a seed form in the Old Testament that in John's picture, John's vision of the end is fulfilled into a big city. So in the New Jerusalem, the blessings of paradise will be restored, but the New Jerusalem is more than paradise regained. It's more than just going back to the Garden of Eden. It's a city, and as a city, it fulfills humanity's desire to build out of nature a human place of human culture and community. So these last two chapters in the book of Revelation are a picture, a description of the final end. We haven't realized it yet. We haven't seen it yet. We're still waiting for it. It's a picture of the final end. And what does John see? He sees a city coming down from heaven. And so it carries with it all of these implications or pictures where it calls us back to the Garden of Eden. But John doesn't describe a garden coming down from heaven. He describes a city. And I think it's interesting. So there's this promise in Genesis 1 to 2. God begins something. He plants a seed. He gives a promise, which finds its fulfillment in Revelation 21, 22. And so there's been development. There's been, it's like the future picture that John has of a city coming down is like, yeah, it takes into account that there have been thousands and thousands of years since the garden, and it takes into account all of this human creativity and human development that's taken place since then till this moment. And so what we can expect when God returns is so what does Richard Bauckham say? He says, it's a fulfillment of our desire to build out of nature a human place of culture and community. Like, one of the things that God says about humanity in Genesis 1 and 2 is that we are made in his image. So we reflect his nature, we reflect his character. And one of the things we can say about God is that he's creative. He creates things. So something that it means to be made in the image of God is that we too are creative. And we're called to outwork our creativity on creation. I always find it really interesting that in Genesis 1 and 2, when the author is when God is describing or speaking to his creation, and he doesn't call it perfect, he calls it good. And that might seem like a semantic, like just nitpicking details, but there is a real difference between perfect and good. Perfect is it's static. It couldn't possibly be better than it is. It is fully perfect. It couldn't possibly be any better. it's static. It can't move or develop. Good implies something about its inherent nature. It is good, and it could be better. It could be improved. It could be developed. It could be changed. It could grow into something else. So I think it's really interesting and telling that God uses the language of good and not perfect. Because if it was perfect, then what John would have seen in Revelation was a garden coming down. But it's like, no, God creates a garden for humanity to live in and thrive in, and actually a garden for humanity to develop. God gives us the building blocks and says, now you be my image, you reflect my nature, you go and be creative with this canvas that I've given you. And so it makes total sense that if Revelation 21 and 22 is the climax of the whole story of God, that the thing that comes down from heaven is not a garden, but a city, right? It's an outworking of our creativity. So just making this connection between the Garden of Eden and the city in Revelation. So there are all of these little pictures that link, or these little things that link these two things together that make us think these are two pictures of the same thing, but with some time between them. So Eden was where Adam walked and talked with God, which is also what the priests do in the temple. So we see, again, just this kind of biblical overview we did, I think it was last week, that actually we see these themes continue to be developed and unpacked. So we see this thing birthed in Genesis 1 and 2, the garden, which then keeps getting repeated throughout the Bible. And it gets repeated in the tabernacle, and then the temple, and then the church, and then this picture of Revelation 21 and 22. Because in the Old Testament, the temple was where the priests walked and talked with God, where they encountered his presence and they met with him like face to face. So Adam is called to cultivate and to keep the garden, these words abad and samar in Hebrew. And these are words that are connected to and used to describe what the priests do in the tabernacle. And so there's a tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and this becomes the model for the lampstand, which sits in the temple outside the Holy of Holies. And again, it's repeated in Revelation 21, 22. What do we find? There's like a description of one tree in those two chapters, and it's the tree of life. And no longer is there the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the temple has a garden-like appearance. It has carved wood, and it has stones that are found in Eden, and it has all of this kind of green garden imagery carved into it. The entrance to Eden was from the east, as per the tabernacle and future temples. So there's a link between the Garden of Eden as a model for the future temple that would come in the Old Testament, and then the description of the at the end in Revelation 21 and 22 is of a city that comes down, and there's a specific thing that John writes. He says, and there was no temple because the lamb and I forgot. The lamb is the temple. So there's no temple. There's no specific building for encounter with God. Instead, all of creation now is a place of encounter with God. All of his restored creation, where heaven and earth are married together, is a place of encounter with the presence of God. So there's this theme that's developed through the whole Bible. So Adam had a job. He was given a job by God to fill and subdue, to have dominion over the whole earth, not just this little bit of real estate in the garden. So God's picture for him was not that he would live and all generations after him would inhabit this tiny little island of paradise in his creation, but that he would go from this to eventually make all the world this paradise place of encounter with God. But he failed to do it. Adam and Eve failed to live up to their mandate. But what they failed to do, Revelation shows that Jesus was faithful to accomplish. So Adam was commissioned to rule and he failed. And God now promises that his people, those who are faithful and obedient and stay the course, will reign without end over this restored creation that he's bringing about. So the garden was a source of death and a curse because of disobedience, but the city that's coming is a place of fulfillment, a place of peace, a place of blessing, and a place of life. So that's all great news. So again, this is not just a weird little book at the end of the Bible that isn't connected at all to the story that's been before, and it just makes for good content for weird Christian movies or weird Christian books. It's a book at the end of the Bible that essentially sums up and brings everything to its completion. It ties everything up. And it says, yeah, all of these promises that were begun in the Old Testament, in fact, that were begun in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God hasn't forgotten the promises. God hasn't given up on his plan. God isn't doing something different. He will bring about the fulfillment of this. He will bring about the fulfillment, and it will look like a place where humanity can flourish and thrive and continue to be creative and to continue to develop. So maybe we'll look a little bit later, but I think we often have this picture of, heaven, which is sort of, it's lovely, but it's kind of boring, right? It's, one day we'll die. That might, I don't know if that's news for any of you, but one day you will die and you will go, and the rest of eternity will be you sitting on a cloud with a white robe, sort of playing a harp, or just this kind of church service that goes on forever. And as a pastor, I don't even want that. And so, and we have this kind of picture, but actually the thing that John paints in the book of Revelation is nothing like that. It's an expression of our creativity that'll go on forever. What will we do for eternity in the presence of God, where heaven and earth are married together? We will just be creative, and we will develop, and we will worship him, and we will be the perfect image of God, expressing his nature, expressing his character in our lives for all of eternity. It sounds amazing to me. So again, this idea of John talks about new heavens and new earth. We often get, we stop at new heavens, right? So our future existence for eternity will be a spiritual existence where we finally get to escape our body and go to live in heaven with God. And so, but John's idea of a new heaven and a new earth is not unique to the New Testament. It's not unique to his book at the end. It finds itself through all of the Old Testament, but specifically in Isaiah 65. And again, there are other, so I create a new heavens, a new earth, and then no more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping, the cry of distress. This is all the language of Revelation. Down in verse 23, all flesh shall come to worship before me. Again, even the Old Testament prophets had this picture of a time where God would come, and it wouldn't just be limited to the people of Israel, but that all of the world would finally see the glory of God, finally see the truth and reality of him, and they would come and they would fall on their knees before him and they would worship him. And so John is picking up in these themes in his scripture, in his tradition. So I think we have 4 things that we should notice, and we've touched on some of it already. 4 things that we should notice. The first is that it's a city. This is what John describes. It's a city, not a garden. It makes sense that the Bible begins with a garden and it ends with a city. The city is described in these final 2 chapters, and it's measured out as 12,000 stadia, or around 5,500 miles. So again, we've looked at how numbers can have significance in what John is doing in the book of Revelation, and it's how he buries or embeds theological meaning into what it is that he's writing. So again, the way some people have read the book of Revelation is face value, very, very literally. So this description of the city would be a literal description of the city. I think you can. I don't know that it matters that you do that. I personally don't think it's the best way to read it, because I think there's a much richer meaning when you treat John using numbers as shorthand or code or symbolism for something that he's describing. So it's a cube. It's 12,000 stadia, length, width, height, and depth, right? So this cube that comes down from heaven. It happens to be about the same size as the landmass of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was the world as John knew it. This was the entire world. And so that's something to bear in mind. John is maybe talking about something that has not just local, a local existence or a local place of being, but is going to encompass and cover the whole world. And also this thing around 12. Remember, 12 is the number for John, how he describes or references the people of God, right? It's a reference to the 12 tribes of Israel, a reference to the 12 apostles. It's John's way of creating a picture of when I'm using the number 12, I'm talking about the people of God. So, and then and then again, it's 12,000. So a thousand in Greek is myriad. It's the biggest number they can think of. So, so a myriad is like, so again, the angels surrounding the throne of God, worshiping him in Revelation 4 and 5 is a myriad of myriads. It's the biggest number I know, multiplied by the biggest number I know. That's how many angels are surrounding. It's uncountable. So again, this is, so 12, the people of God, times 1,000, a myriad, the biggest number I know. The fullness and completion of those faithful, obedient disciples of Jesus from all nations, all tribes, all tongues, all languages, come together to worship and to dwell together in his presence. So it's a cube. Again, it's no accident that John describes it as a cube. The Holy of Holies was a cube. And what was the function of the Holy of Holies? This is where God's presence was. This is where he dwelt within, like, the inner room of the temple. This is where the presence of God was. And yeah, cool. Okay, so the first, it's a city. So that's something to bear in mind. It's a development of our creativity. It's the fullness. It covers the entire earth. It's the fullness of the people of God. The second thing is that we should bear in mind is that it's described as a physical city. So the picture that John paints in Revelation 21 and 22 is not of a spiritual existence floating in the clouds. It's a very real, very physical existence. He doesn't describe God screwing up his physical creation and throwing it in the trash bin as a failed experiment while he removes us. He takes our spirits to heaven, those who are faithful and who stay the course. He takes our spirits to heaven to dwell in heaven with him. That's not the picture that we have in Revelation. The picture that we have in Revelation is a very physical existence for eternity. It's a marriage of heaven and earth. So it's the same as what's been before, and it's different to what's been before. There's something that fundamentally changes in this marriage, this connection of heaven and earth. So it will be familiar to us, and it will be very different to us. It will be an existence where it's physical, but married with heaven. Finally, heaven and earth are connected for eternity. And we see a picture of this in the resurrection of Jesus. So he was recognizable by his disciples, but they often mistook him for someone else first. So there was something different about him, but when they realized it was him, they could see the similarities. So in English, we say there's continuity, there's something that continues, and there's discontinuity. There's something that's radically different about this. So it's a city, it's a physical city. You can look forward to an eternity of physical embodiment in some kind of amazing creation that marries heaven and earth together, where you get to be creative and you get to develop and you get to express everything that God has put within you that reflects the image of God. We need to move on. The third thing is that God dwells in the city. And so there's the boundary that's between heaven and earth is permanently removed. And so God's forever felt presence will fill this restored creation. Again, it should remind us of Genesis 1 and 2. And in fact, this is the most significant thing about these two chapters. It's all about this, that this is a place where God will dwell. Again, not necessarily a specific city on earth, but his whole restored, renewed creation that marries heaven and earth together. This is the picture. This is, yeah, if you take nothing else away, this is the thing that John wants to communicate in these two chapters. But we should notice that there are some things missing in this new creation. So there's no sea. That's at the very start of Revelation 21, a description that there is no sea. The sea for ancient people is a symbol of chaos and of evil. And so where does the beast come out from in the book of Revelation? It comes out of the sea. It's a picture of the sea is a place that was dangerous and chaotic, and often used as a description of where evil comes from, or a place of death. So it's no surprise when the disciples see Jesus walking on the water, they assume it's a what? Because nothing good comes from the water. So again, will there be the sea in the restored creation? So all of you people who love beaches, all of you Danes, you'd live at the beach if you could. All of you people who love beaches, no need to grieve or to mourn or to not look forward to this moment. I think there will still be beaches. I think there will still be physical ocean. John is talking about the realm or the existence of chaotic things and evil things that will no longer be in this restored creation. No death, no tears or mourning or crying, no evil, unclean or accursed things or people. Again, no temple. Why? Because you don't need a specific building to encounter the presence of God. He infuses all of his creation. He's present everywhere. There'll be no sun, no moon, no night, no closed gates. So everything that prevents us from flourishing together in the presence of God is removed. This is the picture that John is painting. Again, no tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Everything that prevents us flourishing is removed. John's making I won't unpack it, but John's making a comparison. He's very clearly making a comparison between Babylon and Jerusalem, right? There are all of these similarities and radical differences around the same point. So, oh boy, man, okay, we'll move. So just to consider, what everything that Babylon is, the New Jerusalem isn't. And it's much better than Babylon. Again, John, why is John making this comparison? Well, for John, Babylon is the empire that he existed within. But it's actually every empire that's ever existed that oppresses, that persecutes, that punishes, that is unjust in some way. And so John is saying, this thing that this power that you're currently under and currently experiencing won't last forever. Something much better is coming. And the reason why he's writing is he's wanting to encourage the church. This is a pastoral letter to 7 churches. Remember that. That's one of the features of this book. And they're plagued by compromise. So in the face of Babylon, in the face of the Roman Empire that they're currently living in, there's a temptation to compromise their belief in order to live well in the empire. John's saying, don't do that, because if you compromise, you're giving up on this much better thing that's coming. And he's encouraging them. He's telling them to anticipate, to look forward to their future glory and perfection. Things might be hard now. They might be difficult now. This is but a moment in eternity. And you have all of eternity to look forward to. And let me pull back the curtain. Let me reveal what that looks like, what eternity looks like for you. And again, we'll look at this in our spirituality section as well, but the contrast between how things are right now and the picture of the future that's coming should cause something to rise up within the people of God, where we cry out for God's kingdom to come. So the worst thing to happen when we read Revelation 21 and 22 is to think, okay, well, I'm just going to sit back, relax, and wait for that to happen. No, John's like, no, this is what's coming, and it should frustrate you and annoy you that you don't see it now. And so, like the saints that were under the altar in the series of judgments, that cry out to God, how long will you wait? When you look around the world and you look around your city or your neighborhood and you see injustice or pain or suffering, death, hurting, disappointment, all of these things, the fact that we know what's coming in the future should cause within us a cry to God, like, how long will you wait before you act, before you come, Lord Jesus. Right. And so, again, you can read the rest of that. C.S. Lewis paints this great picture. I don't know if you've read the Narnia books. I absolutely ruined my copy of the Narnia books when I was a kid. I read and reread them. And The Last Battle is this powerful book that has this powerful picture at the end of what it will be like to step into eternity with God. And he writes this, and as he spoke, Aslan, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But this is the key thing. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. I think this is such a great unpacking or picture of what John saw in the book of Revelation. You don't have to be worried about being bored in heaven. Every chapter, to be in the presence of God, to step into this picture that's coming, will be better than anything that's come before, and you'll realize that everything that came before was the prologue. It was the introduction to the real story, and the real story will go on forever, and it will get better and better and better and better forever. That's the picture. That is the picture of Revelation 21 and 22, and C.S. Lewis sums it up so well here. But so there's some there. Before we go to a breakout room, it's not all good news in Revelation 21 and 22. John also includes this in chapter 21, but the cowards, the faithless, the detestable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their share will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. So I before the Danes get offended, I ran the title of this next slide past a Danish old Dobberin, past Ingrid, and she said it was fine to use it. She thought it was funny, but I understand this might be provocative. So John begins to he throws out this picture of hell as a place of the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. So there is a reality that exists for those who are faithful, who stay the course, who continue in obedience to the gospel and to Jesus Christ, and they get to inherit this great picture. But he says there's actually an alternative inheritance for those who don't do that, who are faithless or who compromise or who willfully engage in sins and give themselves over to their lusts and their desires. So we have to talk about hell, although very briefly. If God then, this is Michael Bird in a systematic theology book, he said, if God is God and the God that we know in Jesus Christ and in the Holy Spirit, so Jesus is the fullness of the revelation of God, and that is what God is like, then no matter what our doubts about the suitability of hell is a very unpopular doctrine or theology these days, or maybe it's always been, but it seems to be particularly these days. So whatever our doubts about the suitability of hell, whether we think it's right or good or proper, we cannot doubt his goodness, mercy, and justice. So that is true about God. He is good, he is merciful, he's patient, and he's just. So that has to be our rule as we approach this topic. Whatever the reality or the truth about hell is, and we have to get that from the Bible, that's God's revelation to us, whatever it is, it will always line up with God's goodness, his mercy, and his justice. Okay, so that's the first thing for us to bear in mind as we talk about hell. So whatever hell looks like, and we need to be careful about not thinking of it through the lens of pop culture, right? As some cavern deep in the earth full of flames and fire, and where the devil reigns and tortures unwilling participants in this place. This is a pop culture picture of hell, not necessarily a biblical picture of hell. We have to remember that hell is ultimately about justice, not about torture. It's not a place for a vengeful, angry, tantrum-throwing God to put people who disagree with him and to torture them for eternity. So there have been two major views about hell in Christian theology. The first is that hell is a place of eternal conscious punishment. That just like those who are faithful go to eternal blessing and eternal life in the presence of God, those who reject that God go to a place of eternal conscious punishment. The second is this idea of conditional immortality, or it's also called annihilationism. And so one of the ways that hell is described in the Bible is as eternal death, right? Or destruction. They go to destruction. And so this major idea in Christian theology is the idea that you and I, we're not immortal. We're not immortal people. We don't have immortality. We're not angels. We're not part of the divine council. We're not gods. We are mortal human creations. And so any immortality that we have, thinking, where we go to eternal life, any immortality that we have is at God's desire, right? It's at God's desire. He desires that we would, he sustains us for an eternity. So this idea is the idea that actually, well, God can choose to not sustain us for an eternity. And so the reality for those who die apart from Jesus would be that they go to eternal nothingness, just death. So these are the two main themes when it comes to the topic of hell. But and this has been something I've wrestled with as well for years, I think. But I think we can't ignore the description of hell that is the clearest in the Bible. That this is something that lasts for an eternity. But here's the thing, again, it's not something that we interpret through pop culture understanding of a vengeful God torturing those who disagreed with him or did some things wrong. It's something that is chosen willfully by people. People would choose to go to hell rather than choose to be in the presence of God. And that may be a thought that's hard to understand for many of us, maybe. Why would you choose that? Why face to face with God would you choose that? And so again, Michael Bird in his evangelical theology says, what is more, some might still prefer in the end to reign in hell rather than to serve in heaven. This is a choice that people would make. For in hell, they still may be able to enjoy their defiance against God. So the picture is that there will be some people who in the presence of God would still, their bitterness, their anger, their hatred of him would still reign. So their experience of his love for them, because he does love them, they wouldn't experience that as warmth, they would experience that as pain. And so they would choose to not be in his presence. So hell is the place for creatures who have rejected God's revelation of himself in both nature, general revelation, and in the gospel, the specific revelation of Jesus. Those who refuse to bow the knee to the one true Lord and who would rather live in darkness than in the light that exposes them. Again, God is the respecter of your choice. And you could choose to live apart from him, and there's a place for you to do that. Or there's a place for you to live in his presence. So this is Michael Bird. He says, I surmise, I suggest that following Tom Wright, that such persons have entered a post-human state. They've left behind their humanity, right? Your humanity is that you are made in the image of God. And so these people who choose to reject God in the end also reject themselves as the image of God. They reject the image of God from their life. They become what they worshiped, right? So they morph, they transform into like expressions of greed or lust or power, whatever it is, and they cease to reflect the divine image in any meaningful sense. They arrived at a state beyond hope and beyond pity. And then Michael Bird says this: hell then is the eternal and punitive punishment, quarantining of a humanity that has ceased to be human. So Michael Bird paints this picture of hell as a quarantine. We know a little bit about that today. So it's, again, what's missing in the new creation, anything that would hinder or get in the way of us flourishing and thriving in the presence of God. And so then God has to respect those who don't want to live within that. And there's a quarantine place for those who would rather give themselves fully over to the hatred of God. He's not going to force them to be in his presence. Okay, so that was a very quick, but we do have to, my goodness, we do have to move on. So there are both these pictures, right, of an eternal dwelling and living in a physical blessed existence in the presence of God for eternity. Just gets better and better and better and better for all of eternity. And then this other place where God also respects free will and those who would willingly choose. C.S. Lewis talks about how hell is locked from the inside. So he's saying hell is something people will choose. They will prefer to be there rather than in the presence of God. And that should grieve us. That should inspire within us mission and a desire to introduce people to the goodness of God, which they are not, which they don't understand, which they don't see, and they interpret incorrectly. Okay, here's what I want us to do. I want us to go out into some breakout rooms. Anna is going to set those up and get those ready to go. You may want to take a photo or a screenshot or something, or make a quick note of this. But I just want you to have a discussion in your groups for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will stop for a quick break and come back. But what has made an impact on you during this course? What stood out? What made an impact on you? And then secondly, has your perception or thinking about the book of Revelation changed? I hope it has. Has something changed in how you approach or think about this book of Revelation? If it was a book that you never opened, maybe it's a book that you begin to read and see through different lenses. Okay, so can we do that? Are we ready? Let's take 15 minutes, and we'll come back and then go for a break. Have a great discussion.